HOA Karen kept driving through my ranch gate, so I installed steel bollards she can't pass. Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop the name of your city, state, or country in the comments below. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel around the world. Thank you for being here. Now, let me take you back to the moment when everything began. Some people think a locked gate is an invitation. They only learn what it really means after they run out of road. The sound wasn't wood splintering this time. It was steel answering steel with a deep, unforgiving clang that rolled across my ranch before the morning sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge. My coffee mug stopped halfway to my mouth. The horses in the north pasture jerked their heads toward the entrance. A flock of meadowlarks exploded from the fence line, scattering into the pale Montana sky. Then came absolute silence, the kind that feels heavier than noise. I looked toward the front gate through my kitchen window and already knew exactly who had ignored every warning sign I had installed over the past 3 weeks. Steam drifted from my coffee while I slowly set the mug on the counter. I wasn't surprised. I'd been expecting this moment ever since the county inspector signed the final approval papers. I grabbed my old ranch hat, stepped onto the porch, and let the cool morning air hit my face. The scent of fresh-cut hay mixed with damp earth from last night's light rain. Gravel crunched beneath my boots as I walked the quarter-mile toward the entrance, each step steady, each breath calm. I wasn't rushing because there was nothing left to prevent. Everything had already happened exactly the way I knew it would. Sitting sideways across the driveway was a white BMW X7 with its front bumper pressed firmly against a pair of bright yellow steel bollards rising from the concrete like they had always belonged there. The engine was still idling. One front wheel spun uselessly against loose gravel. The driver's window slid down with a sharp electric hum, and Linda Whitmore leaned halfway out, her face glowing with equal parts disbelief and frustration. "What is this supposed to be?" she demanded before I had even reached the truck parked beside the gate. I simply looked at the new bollards, then at the large reflective sign standing less than 20 feet away. Private property. No public access. Authorized vehicles only. County permit on file. The sign was impossible to miss unless someone had already decided the rules didn't apply to them. Linda threw one hand into the air. "You can't block this road. Hundreds of people use it." I couldn't help noticing that she didn't say owned it. She said used it. There was a difference, and before this was over, that difference would cost her more than she ever imagined. The first sheriff's deputy arrived less than 10 minutes later, tires whispering over the gravel instead of screaming like television police chases. Deputy Aaron Collins stepped out, tipped his hat toward me, and glanced once at the steel posts before pulling a folded folder from beneath his arm. He recognized the location immediately. He'd been here before, more than once. Linda wasted no time marching toward him with both hands waving dramatically. "He sabotaged the entrance," she declared. "He's trapping residents. This is the only shortcut into the subdivision." Aaron didn't answer right away. Instead, he quietly unfolded the county permit, compared the permit number to the metal inspection tag bolted onto one of the posts, and nodded almost to himself. That tiny nod told me everything I needed to know. The paperwork had beaten the argument before it even started. Linda's expression changed almost instantly. Confidence faded into confusion. Confusion slowly became panic. She finally realized something that should have been obvious from the very beginning. She had spent nearly a year treating my family's private ranch entrance like it was a public street simply because nobody had stopped her in a way she couldn't ignore. What she didn't know was that this morning wasn't the beginning of our story. It was the ending of hers. To understand why 2 steel bollards ended an entire HOA's favorite shortcut, you have to go back almost 11 months, to the first morning I watched tire tracks cut across the entrance my grandfather built with his own hands nearly 50 years ago. 11 months earlier, none of this looked like the beginning of a fight. It looked like another peaceful spring morning on the Walker Ranch. The first light always reached the eastern pasture before it touched the house, painting the grass with a soft golden glow while the mountains still carried streaks of snow across their peaks. I had lived on that property for nearly my entire life, and even after 44 years, I never got tired of stepping onto the porch before sunrise with a cup of black coffee in one hand and hearing nothing but meadowlarks, distant cattle, and the wind moving through the cottonwood trees. My grandfather bought the ranch shortly after returning from military service. My father expanded it one fence line at a time until it covered nearly 800 acres. When he passed away 6 years earlier, every gate, every fence post, every irrigation ditch, and every weathered barn became my responsibility. None of it was glamorous, but every inch carried a memory. The entrance gate was my favorite part. Most people saw an ordinary wooden ranch gate. I saw weekends spent beside my father learning how to square heavy cedar beams, how to set hinges that would never sag, and why a good gate was supposed to welcome honest neighbors while reminding strangers that they were entering someone else's home. The road beyond that gate was never a public road. It was a private ranch lane that crossed our property for almost 3/4 of a mile before reaching the county highway. The paperwork proving that fact filled an entire drawer inside my office, and every survey completed during the past 50 years showed exactly the same boundary lines. For decades, nobody questioned it because nobody needed to. Our nearest neighbors respected the property, waved when they drove past, and called before stopping by. That changed when a new subdivision appeared on the opposite side of the ridge. Within 2 years, more than 100 homes stood where open pasture had once stretched for miles. Along with those homes came an active homeowners association determined to organize everything within sight, even things they did not own. At first, I barely noticed. Families moved in. Children rode bicycles. People waved from their driveways. Most of them seemed friendly enough. Then one Monday morning, while repairing a section of fence near the entrance, I noticed fresh tire tracks leading through my gate. That was unusual because none of my suppliers were scheduled to arrive until Wednesday. I assumed somebody had taken a wrong turn. The following morning, there were more tracks. By Friday, I counted nearly 20 different sets crossing the gravel lane before daylight. The dust alone lingered over the pasture for hours, settling onto the fences and drifting toward the horse barn. My cattle began gathering farther away from the entrance, avoiding the constant flow of unfamiliar vehicles. At first, I tried giving people the benefit of the doubt. I stood beside the gate one morning and politely waved down a young couple driving through in a silver pickup truck. They rolled down the window and smiled before I even spoke. The driver apologized immediately and explained that the navigation application on his phone suggested my ranch road as the fastest route to the subdivision entrance. He thanked me for pointing out the mistake, turned around without complaint, and never came back. That conversation reminded me that most people are reasonable when they know the facts. Unfortunately, not everyone wanted the facts. 3 days later, I watched a white sport utility vehicle approach without slowing down. It passed directly beneath the large private property sign hanging on the gate, rolled across my cattle guard, and continued toward the subdivision as though the ranch had become part of the neighborhood. Behind the wheel sat a woman wearing oversized sunglasses with one hand resting casually on the steering wheel, completely confident that nobody would question where she was going. I did not know her name yet, but something about the certainty in her expression made me realize that this was not someone who had made an innocent mistake. She believed she belonged there, and before long, I would discover that convincing her otherwise would become the biggest challenge my family had faced in decades. The next morning, I was waiting by the gate before sunrise, partly because I wanted to confirm what I had seen the day before, and partly because something in my gut told me it was not an isolated incident. The sky was still painted in shades of blue and gray when headlights appeared over the hill. The same white sport utility vehicle rolled toward the entrance without slowing down. It passed the private property sign, crossed the cattle guard, and continued along my ranch road as though it had been paved for her personal commute. This time I stepped into clear view and raised one hand. She finally stopped about 20 feet away and lowered her window with an impatient sigh instead of a greeting. Up close, she looked to be in her early 50s, dressed in an expensive business jacket despite the dusty country road. She glanced at me for only a moment before looking at her dashboard clock. "Can I help you?" I asked politely. "Actually, you can," she replied. "I'm already running late, so if you could move, that would be appreciated." Her confidence caught me completely off guard. I smiled and pointed toward the sign hanging beside the gate. "This is private property. I need you to use the county road around the ridge." She looked at the sign for less than a second before shrugging. "That road adds almost 5 minutes during morning traffic." I answered calmly. "I understand, but this road belongs to my family." She leaned one elbow on the window frame and laughed softly. "You are the ranch owner?" Yes. Well, I am Linda Whitmore. I am president of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association. We have been using this road for weeks. Nobody has complained until now. I almost laughed at the logic. Nobody had permission either. She waved one hand dismissively. It is just a road. You have hundreds of acres. Surely sharing one driveway is not a hardship. I looked beyond her vehicle where my horses had already moved farther into the pasture because of the engine noise. It is not about the distance. It is about ownership, livestock, insurance, and safety. Linda smiled as though explaining something to a child. Communities work best when everyone cooperates. Cooperation begins with asking, I replied. Nobody ever asked. Her smile disappeared. Our residents have become accustomed to this shortcut. Then they will need to become accustomed to the county road again. She stared at me for several long seconds before putting the vehicle into gear. We will see about that. Those 5 words lingered in the quiet long after she drove away. Over the next several days, traffic did not decrease. It multiplied. Every morning brought another line of unfamiliar vehicles crossing my property. Sport utility vehicles, pickup trucks, delivery vans. Even landscaping trailers bounced over the cattle guard before daylight. Dust settled across freshly painted fences. Gates were left partially open. My cattle changed their grazing patterns. One afternoon, I discovered fresh tire marks only a few feet from a water trough because someone had pulled off the gravel to let another vehicle pass. What concerned me even more was how comfortable everyone seemed. Drivers waved at one another as though they were using a neighborhood street instead of a working ranch. Then came the first letter. It arrived inside a bright white envelope with the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association logo printed neatly across the corner. I opened it expecting some kind of apology or request for an easement agreement. Instead, the letter informed me that vegetation along the community access corridor needed trimming because overhanging tree branches created an unattractive appearance for neighborhood residents. I read the page twice just to make sure I had not misunderstood it. They were instructing me to maintain a road they did not own, on land they did not own, because they had decided it benefited their neighborhood. I actually laughed out loud before placing the letter on my kitchen table. That evening, I called the telephone number listed at the bottom of the page. Linda answered on the second ring. I received your notice, I said. Good, she replied. We appreciate prompt attention to community concerns. Linda, I answered carefully. There seems to be some confusion. My ranch is not part of your homeowners association. There was a brief silence before she responded with complete confidence. It may not technically be part of the subdivision, Ethan, but your entrance directly affects our neighborhood. We expect neighboring property owners to maintain standards that benefit the community. At that moment, I realized this was never about saving 5 minutes on a morning drive. Somewhere along the way, Linda had convinced herself that repeated use created entitlement, and entitlement somehow created authority. She believed that if enough people ignored a property line for long enough, the property line would eventually stop existing. She had no idea that I had already begun collecting every letter, every photograph, every camera recording, and every county document because I was starting to understand that this disagreement would not be settled with a simple conversation. From that day forward, I stopped trying to convince Linda with opinions and started relying on facts. Every morning before heading out to feed the horses, I checked the small notebook that stayed on my kitchen table beside the coffee maker. The first page held a simple date. Every page after that recorded the same pattern. Number of vehicles, time they entered, time they left, license plate if it was visible, weather conditions, any damage to the road or fences. At first it felt excessive, but years of working as a mechanical engineer before returning to the ranch had taught me one valuable lesson. Patterns become evidence when they are documented carefully enough. Within 3 weeks, I had recorded more than 400 unauthorized trips across my property. Some mornings the line of vehicles stretched all the way back to the subdivision entrance. The gravel lane that had comfortably served tractors and livestock trailers for decades now carried impatient commuters balancing coffee cups while checking their phones. Fine dust drifted across my hay fields every morning, coating fresh grass before the livestock reached it. The wooden gate my father and I had rebuilt years earlier no longer closed as smoothly because people kept swinging it open instead of waiting for someone to unlock it properly. Twice I found it standing wide open after sunset. Fortunately, none of the cattle wandered onto the county road. But every rancher knows that leaving a gate open even once can become an expensive mistake. I installed 2 trail cameras near the entrance, not to catch anyone doing something dramatic, but simply to establish an accurate record. The cameras quietly collected hundreds of hours of footage showing the same routine every weekday. Vehicles entered through a clearly marked private gate, drove nearly 3/4 of a mile across my ranch, and exited through an opening near the subdivision that had originally been intended only for ranch equipment. Every image reinforced the same truth. Nobody was confused. They were making a deliberate choice. I decided to reach out one more time before involving anyone else. I drafted a respectful letter addressed to the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association board explaining that the road was private, that no public easement existed, and that increasing traffic was affecting livestock operations, maintenance costs, and liability concerns. I attached copies of the recorded property survey, highlighted the legal boundary lines, and invited the board to meet with me at the ranch if anyone wanted to review the documents together. A week passed without a response. Then another white envelope appeared in my mailbox. This time the board thanked me for my correspondence before explaining that many residents considered the ranch road an important convenience and hoped I would continue being a good neighbor by allowing unrestricted access. The letter even suggested that increased traffic might improve local property values because it created a more connected community. I read that sentence twice before folding the paper and placing it beside the first letter. Convenience, I realized, had somehow become more important than ownership in their minds. A few days later, I attended one of the monthly association meetings as a guest. The meeting was held inside the subdivision clubhouse, a clean brick building decorated with framed landscape photographs and carefully arranged flower beds. When I introduced myself, several residents smiled politely. Most of them seemed genuinely surprised to learn that I actually owned the ranch road. They had been told it functioned as shared access for years. Linda, however, remained perfectly composed. During the discussion, she thanked me for attending, acknowledged that the land technically belonged to my family, and then immediately shifted the conversation toward what she called community expectations. She explained that cooperation required compromise and suggested that closing the road would create unnecessary inconvenience for more than 100 households. I calmly replied that I was not asking anyone to compromise. I was simply asking everyone to respect clearly marked private property. A few residents nodded thoughtfully, but Linda quickly moved to the next agenda item before anyone could ask additional questions. Walking back to my truck that evening, I understood something important. The people driving across my ranch were not all acting out of disrespect. Many had accepted Linda's version of the situation because it sounded reasonable and nobody had shown them anything different. The real problem was not misinformation alone. It was confidence delivered without evidence. That realization changed my entire approach. I stopped arguing entirely. Instead, I scheduled appointments with the county surveyor, my insurance representative, and a property attorney. If this situation was eventually going to be resolved, I wanted every future decision to rest on engineering, documentation, permits, and the law rather than frustration. I had no interest in embarrassing anyone or creating a neighborhood feud. I simply intended to protect the land my grandfather had purchased, my father had preserved, and one day I hoped to pass along in exactly the same condition to the next generation. The county surveyor arrived on a cool Tuesday morning carrying 3 rolled maps inside a weathered leather tube that looked almost as old as my ranch itself. His name was Daniel Foster, and unlike everyone else involved so far, he had no opinion about shortcuts, neighborhood convenience, or homeowners associations. He cared only about property records, boundary markers, and legal descriptions. We spent nearly 4 hours walking the entrance together, measuring reference points that had not changed in decades. Every iron survey pin was exactly where previous records said it should be. Every legal description matched the deeds stored at the county courthouse. When we finally returned to the porch, Daniel spread the maps across my picnic table and traced one finger along the gravel lane. "There is no public easement here," he said plainly. "There never has been." I asked whether there was any document granting the subdivision permission to cross my property. He shook his head without hesitation. "Nothing. If someone told those residents otherwise, they were mistaken." That conversation answered the biggest question I had been carrying for months. I was not dealing with a confusing legal gray area. The law was remarkably clear. The uncertainty existed only because one person had repeated the same assumption often enough that other people accepted it as fact. A few days later, I met with my insurance representative, who walked the entrance with me while taking photographs from several different angles. She explained something I had considered but never fully appreciated. Every unauthorized vehicle using the ranch road increased my exposure to potential liability. If a driver lost control during icy weather, if livestock wandered near traffic, or if someone claimed damage while crossing my property, my insurance company would likely become involved regardless of who had permission to be there. The safest road, she said while closing her notebook, is the one only authorized vehicles are using. Her recommendation was simple: restrict access in a clear, lawful, and highly visible manner. My attorney reached the same conclusion from a legal perspective. During our meeting, he reviewed every photograph, every camera recording, every letter from the Homeowners Association, and every page from my notebook. He complimented the organization more than once. Most property disputes become difficult because people rely on memory, he told me. You relied on documentation. Then he asked a question that changed everything. If you wanted to prevent unauthorized vehicles without creating any hazard, what would you build? The engineer inside me immediately started working. I had spent years designing industrial equipment before returning full-time to the ranch. I understood structural loads, concrete foundations, and impact-resistant installations. My goal was not to trap anyone or damage a vehicle. My goal was to create a permanent, unmistakable boundary that no reasonable person could misunderstand. That evening, I sat in my workshop surrounded by graph paper, measuring tapes, and old engineering reference books. I sketched several possible entrance designs before rejecting most of them. A heavier wooden gate could still be forced open. A chain across the road could create unnecessary risk. Decorative stone pillars would be expensive without solving the underlying problem. Then I remembered a municipal project I had worked on years earlier involving retractable steel security bollards installed outside a government facility. They were simple, durable, highly visible, and specifically designed to control vehicle access without creating confusion. More importantly, they were recognized safety equipment installed throughout the country when properly permitted and marked. The next morning, I contacted a local contractor specializing in commercial access control systems. We met at the ranch 2 days later. After examining the entrance, he smiled and said almost the exact words I had been hoping to hear. This can absolutely be done, and it can be done by the book. We discussed foundation depth, reflective coatings, drainage, winter maintenance, and spacing that would allow my tractors, livestock trailers, emergency responders, and other authorized vehicles to pass safely while preventing ordinary passenger vehicles from treating the lane like a public shortcut. Before leaving, he reminded me that every step required permits and inspections. I smiled because that was exactly what I wanted. If this project moved forward, every bolt, every inch of reinforced concrete, every warning sign, and every measurement would satisfy county requirements. There would be no shortcuts in building the solution to a problem created by people who believed shortcuts solved everything. As I watched his truck disappear down the county road, I felt something I had not experienced in months. Not anger, not satisfaction, certainty. For the first time since Linda had driven through my gate with complete confidence, I could finally see the path toward a lasting solution. It would not involve arguments, raised voices, or dramatic confrontations. It would involve permits, engineering drawings, inspections, reflective signs, reinforced concrete, and patient preparation. The people using my ranch road still believed they were winning because nobody had physically stopped them yet. What they could not see was that every survey, every inspection, every approved document, and every carefully measured blueprint was quietly becoming another piece of the foundation beneath the decision that would eventually bring the entire situation to an unmistakable end. Construction began 2 weeks later under a cloudless Montana sky that seemed almost too peaceful for everything that had led up to that moment. Just after 7 o'clock, the contractor's crew arrived with a flatbed trailer carrying bright yellow steel bollards wrapped in protective padding, a compact excavator, bags of concrete mix, and enough surveying equipment to make it clear this was not a quick weekend project. Every permit had already been approved. Every utility line had been marked. Every measurement had been reviewed twice. Before a single shovel touched the ground, I walked the crew through the property and explained why precision mattered more than speed. We were not building a barrier out of frustration. We were installing permanent access control that had to meet every applicable county requirement. The foreman nodded and smiled. Then we do it once, and we do it right. Those words reminded me of something my father used to say whenever we repaired fences after winter storms. Temporary fixes create permanent headaches. The crew stretched bright orange survey string across the entrance while laser levels projected perfectly straight reference lines over the gravel. Massive holes were carefully excavated beneath the future locations of each bollard, extending several feet into stable ground before reinforced steel cages were lowered into place. I stood nearby for most of the morning watching concrete flow around the reinforcement, knowing that almost everything being buried beneath the surface would never be seen again. Ironically, that hidden foundation would become the strongest part of the entire installation. While the concrete cured, another crew replaced the faded entrance signs with large reflective panels positioned where approaching drivers could see them from hundreds of feet away. Private property. No public access. Authorized vehicles only. All vehicle traffic subject to county property laws. Every letter exceeded visibility standards. Fresh reflective tape outlined the bollards themselves so they would remain highly visible before sunrise, after sunset, and during winter snowstorms. Solar-powered warning lights were mounted along both sides of the entrance to illuminate automatically whenever daylight faded. Nothing about the completed entrance would surprise an attentive driver. That was the entire point. During construction, traffic from the subdivision slowed almost every hour. Some residents rolled down their windows and politely asked what was being built. I explained exactly the same thing every time. A permanent entrance improvement for private property. Most simply nodded and continued toward the county road without complaint. A surprising number even apologized after realizing they had unknowingly crossed the ranch for months because a neighbor had told them it was acceptable. Those conversations reinforced what I had begun to suspect. Many residents had never intended to disrespect my property. They had trusted information that turned out to be incomplete. Linda, however, reacted very differently. On the third afternoon, she arrived in her familiar white sport utility vehicle, stopped beside the construction area, and climbed out carrying a folder tucked beneath one arm. She looked over the excavation, the fresh concrete, the reflective signs, and finally the partially installed steel posts. "You cannot seriously expect people to drive all the way around after this is finished," she said. I replied calmly. "They have always been supposed to use the county road." She shook her head. "This creates unnecessary inconvenience for the entire community." I reached into my truck and handed her copies of the approved permits along with the county survey confirming the private boundary. She glanced at the first page for only a moment before folding the documents closed. "Our attorney will review these," she said confidently. "That is certainly your right," I answered. "Mine was to build this correctly." She stared at the new warning signs for several seconds before returning to her vehicle without another word. As she drove away, the foreman quietly looked at me and asked, "Do you think she actually read the paperwork?" I smiled. No, she only looked for a reason not to. By the end of the week, the installation was complete. The concrete had fully cured. The inspection tags were permanently attached. The county inspector walked the entrance with a clipboard, checked every required measurement, verified the permit numbers, and signed the final approval without requesting a single correction. Before leaving, he pointed toward the bright yellow posts and said something that stayed with me. "Nobody paying attention will accidentally hit these." That sentence echoed in my mind over the following days as life gradually returned to normal around the ranch. The horses wandered peacefully near the entrance again. Dust no longer drifted across the pasture every morning because traffic had almost disappeared overnight. Most residents adapted immediately, choosing the public road without complaint once the property boundary became impossible to ignore. Yet every dawn, while drinking coffee on my porch, I noticed one familiar white sport utility vehicle slowing near the entrance before driving away again. Linda never rolled down her window. She never stopped to speak. She simply stared at the new installation for a few quiet seconds, as though waiting for reality to change into something more convenient. I had a feeling that sooner or later she would decide to test whether carefully engineered facts were any more negotiable than clearly written property records. And when that day finally arrived, every permit, every inspection, every warning sign, and every inch of reinforced concrete would quietly answer the question for me. 4 mornings passed without incident, and I began to wonder if the message had finally been received. The entrance remained quiet except for the occasional feed truck, veterinary pickup, or neighboring rancher who had called ahead before arriving. The gravel stayed smooth instead of filling with fresh tire tracks. My horses returned to grazing near the front pasture without lifting their heads every few minutes at the sound of passing engines. Even the dust settled differently. It no longer hung over the fields like a daily reminder that strangers had decided my property belonged to everyone. For the first time in months, the ranch felt like home again. Then came Friday morning. The clock on my kitchen wall read 5:47 when I heard an engine climbing the hill toward the entrance. It was a familiar sound, steady and confident, not the hesitant pace of someone approaching an unfamiliar driveway. I carried my coffee to the front window and watched headlights sweep across the wooden fence before stopping briefly near the warning signs. For a moment, I honestly believed the driver had decided to turn around. Instead, the headlights straightened toward the entrance once again. A second later came the deep metallic sound that echoed across the pasture, not explosive or violent, but firm enough that every horse in the nearest field lifted its head at the same time. The vehicle came to an immediate stop. Steam drifted lazily into the cool morning air, while everything else became strangely quiet. I finished setting my coffee mug on the counter before walking outside. There was no urgency in my steps because nothing unexpected had happened. As I approached the entrance, I saw the familiar white sport utility vehicle resting motionless in front of the steel bollards. The reflective warning signs stood exactly where they had been installed. The yellow posts remained perfectly upright. The concrete beneath them showed no visible movement at all. Linda lowered her window before I reached the driver's door. "Your barricades damaged my vehicle," she announced, sounding more offended than surprised. I looked first at the warning signs, then at the inspection tag still bolted to one of the bollards, and finally back at her. "These are permanent access control posts installed under county permit," I replied calmly. The signs were visible before sunrise, and the reflective markings were illuminated. She pointed toward the entrance with obvious frustration. "You knew people used this road." "I knew unauthorized drivers had been using it," I answered. "That is exactly why the county approved this installation." Before either of us said another word, another vehicle appeared behind hers. This time it belonged to Deputy Aaron Collins. He parked on the shoulder, stepped out with the same calm expression I remembered from previous visits, and walked directly toward the entrance. Linda immediately began explaining her version of events. She insisted that the new installation created an unreasonable obstacle and accused me of intentionally making access impossible for neighborhood residents. Aaron listened without interrupting. When she finished, he quietly walked the length of the entrance. He examined the reflective signs, measured the distance between the warning panels and the bollards, photographed the inspection plate attached to the steel post, and compared the permit number against the paperwork already stored inside his folder. Finally, he turned toward Linda. "These installations appear to comply with the approved county permit," he said evenly. "The entrance is clearly marked as private property, and authorized access restrictions are plainly visible." Linda stared at him in disbelief. "So you are saying this is my fault?" Aaron answered carefully, choosing his words with obvious professionalism. "I am saying the property owner has the legal right to control vehicle access to private land through approved safety measures. Based on what I see here, the warnings were visible and the installation meets the permit documentation." She folded her arms and looked toward me as though expecting some kind of apology. Instead, I simply handed the deputy copies of the survey, inspection certificate, engineering drawings, and approval paperwork that I had kept together inside a waterproof binder since construction was completed. Aaron flipped through the documents, nodded once, and returned them. "Everything appears to be in order." Within another 20 minutes, a tow truck arrived to assist with removing the vehicle from the entrance. The operator carefully examined the steel posts before quietly commenting that he had seen similar installations protecting commercial buildings throughout the state. As he prepared the vehicle for transport, several subdivision residents stopped nearby after noticing the activity. More than one of them looked first at the warning signs and then at the roadway, before quietly turning around to use the public entrance without saying a word. Standing there in the cool morning air, I realized something important. The steel bollards had never been the real lesson. They were simply the visible result of months of patient preparation. The real answer had been built long before the concrete was poured. Inside every survey, every permit, every inspection, every photograph, and every page of careful documentation that transformed one person's opinion into an undeniable legal fact. By that afternoon, the story had already spread through Cedar Ridge faster than I ever could have imagined. Not because I had called anyone or posted anything online, but because people naturally pay attention when something they believed for months suddenly collides with reality. The white sport utility vehicle had been removed before most residents left for work, yet conversations continued all day. Several homeowners who had attended earlier association meetings remembered my visit to the clubhouse and the documents I had tried to present. Others admitted they had always assumed the gravel road belonged to the county because they had been told it was shared access when they purchased their homes. Curiosity replaced certainty almost overnight. 2 days later, I received an unexpected telephone call from a member of the Cedar Ridge board who introduced himself as Michael Bennett. Unlike every previous conversation I had experienced with the association, his tone was calm and respectful. He asked whether he and 2 other board members could visit the ranch to review the property records in person. I agreed immediately. The following Monday, they arrived carrying notebooks instead of opinions. We sat together on my porch for nearly 2 hours while I spread out the county surveys, recorded deeds, inspection reports, permit approvals, insurance correspondence, and photographs documenting the unauthorized traffic over the previous 11 months. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. They simply compared dates, signatures, legal descriptions, and official county stamps. Eventually, Michael leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. "This is not what we were told," I answered honestly. "That is becoming clear to me as well." One board member quietly admitted that Linda had repeatedly described the ranch lane as a long-established neighborhood access route that had never been questioned by previous owners. The actual county records showed exactly the opposite. The entrance had always remained private, and no recorded easement had ever transferred access rights to the subdivision. By the end of the meeting, every visitor thanked me for organizing the documentation so carefully. Before leaving, Michael asked one final question. "Would you be willing to attend another board meeting if we invited the residents?" I accepted without hesitation because I had never wanted an argument. I had wanted understanding. The meeting took place 3 evenings later inside the same clubhouse where my concerns had once been brushed aside. This time the atmosphere felt completely different. Instead of discussing assumptions, everyone focused on official documents displayed on a projector screen. The county survey appeared first, then the deed, then the permit approving the new access control installation. Finally, the recorded photographs and camera timestamps showed months of unauthorized traffic entering through clearly marked private property. Questions from residents were thoughtful rather than confrontational. Many wanted to understand how the misunderstanding had continued for so long. Others apologized for driving across the ranch after realizing they had relied on incorrect information. Several even thanked me for remaining patient instead of escalating the disagreement months earlier. Linda attended the meeting as well, although she spoke very little. For the first time since I had met her, she seemed to understand that confidence alone could not outweigh documented facts. After nearly 2 hours of discussion, the remaining board members voted to adopt a formal resolution instructing all residents to use only the public subdivision entrance and acknowledging that the ranch road had always been private property. They also agreed to distribute corrected information to every homeowner so the misunderstanding would not continue with future residents. Over the following weeks, the changes became visible throughout the neighborhood. Navigation applications were updated after the county submitted corrected access information. New residents received welcome packets explaining that the ranch entrance was not available for public travel. The daily stream of commuter traffic disappeared completely. More surprisingly, several families who lived closest to my property began stopping by the front gate on weekends, not to ask for access, but simply to introduce themselves properly. One couple even brought homemade apple pie as a gesture of goodwill. We stood beside the very gate that had once symbolized conflict and spent nearly an hour talking about horses, weather, and the history of the valley. Those conversations reminded me that communities are built through honesty, not convenience. A few weeks later, I received a short letter from the Homeowners Association. It was signed by the newly appointed board president and expressed appreciation for my patience throughout the entire situation. The association acknowledged the importance of respecting neighboring property rights and confirmed that future board decisions would rely on verified county records rather than assumptions. I folded the letter and placed it inside the same drawer that still held every earlier notice Linda had sent me. Together, they told a complete story. One stack represented entitlement without evidence. The other represented accountability built on facts. Looking back, I realized the most satisfying part of the entire experience was not watching steel bollards perform exactly as they had been engineered to do. It was watching an entire community choose truth once the evidence became impossible to ignore. In the end, no dramatic confrontation changed anyone's mind. Patient documentation did. Nearly a year has passed since that quiet Friday morning, and every sunrise across the Walker Ranch feels the way it used to before strangers decided that convenience mattered more than respect. The gravel lane once again belongs to tractors, livestock trailers, veterinarians, feed deliveries, and the handful of neighbors who still call before stopping by for coffee. The horses graze peacefully near the entrance without lifting their heads every few minutes at the sound of unfamiliar engines. Dust no longer hangs over the pasture before breakfast. The front gate opens only when it is supposed to, and every evening it closes with the same solid sound my father taught me to appreciate all those years ago. A few months after everything settled down, I replaced the weathered cedar gate with a new one built from timber harvested on the ranch itself. I followed the same measurements my father had shown me decades earlier, right down to the spacing between the cross braces and the angle of the diagonal support. Some people who drive past probably see nothing more than another ranch entrance. I see 3 generations of my family standing together every time those hinges swing open. The steel bollards are still there, quietly anchored beneath layers of reinforced concrete exactly where they were installed. They have not needed to prove their strength again because they no longer have to. Their greatest success is not stopping vehicles. It is reminding everyone that property boundaries are real, visible, and worthy of respect. Every now and then a new resident moves into Cedar Ridge and accidentally turns toward my entrance before noticing the reflective signs. They slow down, read the warnings, smile awkwardly, and continue toward the public road without any confusion. The corrected neighborhood information, updated navigation systems, and honest conversations have accomplished what arguments never could. One autumn afternoon, Michael Bennett stopped by the ranch with several members of the Homeowners Association after their annual community cleanup project. Instead of discussing disputes or paperwork, we spent an hour walking through the horse pasture while I explained how rotational grazing worked and why certain sections of fencing looked different from others. Before leaving, one board member paused beside the gate and quietly said, "I think we all forgot that this was someone's home before we ever saw it as a shortcut." I nodded because that single sentence captured everything I had been trying to explain from the beginning. Land is never just land to the family that cares for it every single day. It carries history, responsibility, memories, and trust. Those things cannot be measured only in acres or property values. Several weeks later, I opened the old drawer in my office where I had stored every document from the entire experience. The first letters demanding that I maintain a road for someone else's convenience sat beside the county surveys, engineering drawings, inspection certificates, permits, meeting notes, and finally the Homeowners Association letter acknowledging the truth. I looked through the stack one last time before placing everything into a labeled archive box and carrying it into the storage room above the workshop. I hope I never need those papers again. Their purpose was never to win an argument. Their purpose was to preserve the truth until the truth could speak for itself. Sometimes people ask whether I regret spending so much time documenting every vehicle, every conversation, and every inspection instead of confronting the situation more aggressively. My answer is always the same. Patience felt slower in the moment, but it built something that anger never could. Every photograph, every survey marker, every permit application, and every respectful conversation became another brick in a foundation that could not be shaken by opinions alone. Looking back now, I do not remember the frustration as much as I remember the lesson. Real authority does not come from speaking the loudest. It comes from standing on facts that remain true even after the conversation ends. My grandfather often told me that a ranch survives because every generation leaves it stronger than they found it. I finally understand what he meant. Strength is not only measured in stronger fences, healthier cattle, or better equipment. Sometimes strength is measured by protecting what is right without losing your patience, your integrity, or your respect for other people along the way. Every evening, just before sunset, I still drive down to the entrance to make one final check before heading back to the house. I listen to the wind moving through the cottonwood trees, watch the last light settle across the pasture, and hear nothing except the quiet sounds that belong on a working ranch. That silence is not empty. It is earned. It reminds me that justice rarely arrives with raised voices or dramatic moments. More often, it arrives through careful preparation, honest documentation, lawful action, and the quiet confidence of knowing that when the truth is built on a solid foundation, it does not have to force anyone to believe it. It simply stands there, unwavering, waiting for everyone else to catch up.